Welcome to Council today, and just a reminder that our meeting is being live streamed. Remember, your mobile phones off, and a break will be taken. And thank you, Councillor Kumar, for indicating that you may wish to receive a call. That's absolutely appropriate. And morning tea will be available at the conclusion of the meeting. It might be lunch, but it depends how we go. I will ask this morning, Councillor Maxwell, if you would open our meeting today, please, with the karakia.
Kia ora koutou. E te atua whakatūwheratia mai kia mātou ngā kuaha o te tika, o te pono, o te māramatanga I tēnei wā ngā wā katoa. Ko ihu kraiti hoki tō mātou kai whakaora. Amen. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you, and I'm sorry, when there was no public in the galleria, I forgot to welcome those online listening to the online streaming this morning. We move now to apologies, and there appear to be none. Nice to have a full council meeting face to face, so much easier. Are there any declarations of interest? There appear to be none. I move now to urgent items not on the agenda, and I wish to move that an urgent item, the Rotorua District Council Representation Arrangements Bill, be deferred to confidential to enable us all as council together to have a free and frank discussion in response to the Attorney-General's request for further information needed to develop policy work. I so move. Thank you. Seconded, Councillor Donaldson. Are there any other urgent items? Councillor.
A point of order. Can we discuss this motion?
No, it's the Chair's ruling that I want to share with you and have a free and frank discussion with you all about a way forward, and that's the Chair's ruling. I have ruled. Are there other confidential items? Councillor Bentley and then Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. You as Mayor found out very early I would not be one to merely follow her
sorry,
and her
I
radical
can't hear
and
you.
blatant.
Sorry, could you speak again? Sorry, I just didn't hear what you're opening.
The Mayor found out very early that I would not be one to merely follow her and her radical and blatant racist ideas. Therefore, she has shunned me from and not sought the practical advice I bring to this council table.
Point of order.
As a result.
Point of order, Councillor Bentley.
As a result, Madam Mayor.
Point of order.
Who's that?
Yeah. I ask you to withdraw and apologise or leave the meeting.
Well, my final statement, Madam Mayor.
No, there is no final say, Councillor Bentley. I take exception
I have no
to your
longer confidence in this council,
Councillor Bentley,
and thereby tender my resignation
Bentley, I ask
effective
you to leave
immediately.
The meeting, please. I've so ruled. Councillor Bentley, just leave the meeting.
I have resigned, Madam
I
Mayor.
take. Oh, there we are.
Ka kite ho.
Thank you.
I take exception to those remarks. We move on now to any other urgent items not on the agenda.
Madam Chair, I know as a chair and as the mayor and worship, you have the right to veto and the right to table it at first. However, there is a lot of public discontentment, and for us to engage in confidential on this matter excludes them for what we've heard all over the media. It's very contentious, and it would have been very fair and democratic to discuss this in public. That's what my concern is.
I've made my ruling, Councillor Kumar. There will be a public statement after our confidential, free and frank discussion, which requires us all to be present. And I'm saddened that Councillor Bentley feels that way and has resigned. Right, we move on.
Point of
now
order,
to-
Your Worship.
Yes,
Are we going to put that to the vote, moving into confidential?
we don't need to. I've
Okay.
made a chair's ruling.
Sorry,
Yes,
point of order.
Councillor McPherson.
Yes. My urgent item is the urgency of addressing the matter that you've declared to shift into confidential. It is of such importance to the public. There is a very, very intense feelings have been generated in this area, and for it to be moved into confidential will be regarded
Point of
by-
order.
Point of order. I have
It's already
made
been
my
ruled.
ruling.
It's already been ruled. That's my point of order.
Thank you. I'll hold up your point of order. Right, we move now to the confirmation of minutes. Do I have a mover and a seconder for the motion that the minutes of the council meeting held on the 31st of March be confirmed as a true and accurate record? Moved Councillor Yates, seconded Councillor Donaldson. Are there any correctness of the minutes to be recorded or noted for discussion? There appear to be none. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Contrary? Carried. Recommendations from other committees. The report of recommendations from other committees. I need a mover and a seconder to receive the report. Recommendations from other committees to be received. Moved Councillor Kai Fong, seconded Councillor Donaldson. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Contrary? Carried. We now need a mover. Oh. Strategy policy. Yeah. I need a mover and a seconder for the motion that the following recommendations of the Strategy, Policy and Finance Committee meeting held on the 14th of April be adopted. Do I have a mover? Councillor Wing, seconder. Councillor Donaldson. Right, are there any questions to Stavros Michael? And in relation to the minutes, urgent items. Oh gosh, it's not on this. Okay, so I'll move now. We should put the resolution. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary? Carried. And we move now, sorry. That's the resolution from Stavros Michael. Yep. We move now to an emergency housing update. I have asked that the minutes of this item, which were in confidential, be moved into public because I believe this is an item relating to emergency housing that does require the public to understand where we're at the moment. So the emergency housing update, we don't need a resolution to bring the item forward.
Sorry, Madam, Your Worship. I just note that there's a second recommendation from Strategy, Policy and Finance as well on the organic waste consultation.
For the...
So we've passed the waste management and minimisation plan, but the second recommendation from the committee on the organic waste collection.
Look, we'll get back to that. I overlooked an urgent item which was related to the minutes in confidential, and I've been reminded by the clerk of the committee that we bring it forward now as an urgent item.
It's just the...
Yeah, it's just the presentation from JP, then we'll resume back to the discussion on the resolution. JP, would you like to come forward, please? Yes, it's not on there.
Morena, everyone, and Morena, Your Worship. My understanding was just a desire to pull the confidential update that I provided to the last council meeting out of confidential and just to go through the same presentation I gave you on the 31st of March here in a public part of the meeting, just so people are aware of the actions we're currently undertaking around some of the emergency housing accommodation providers. So I've just got the same presentation that I gave to you on the 31st of March. I have added one slide, which I've just identified as an additional slide, which just talks to the steps we've taken about engaging with some accommodation providers. So councillors, again, I'll just slowly go through this presentation, which just talks about the emergency housing provision in the city over the last sort of 2 years. So the report I provided to you on the 31st of March really looked back at the previous 2 years and really just identified the sequence of events that really shaped the responses of council and obviously our community as we went through what has been a number of disruptive pandemic lockdowns across those 2 years as we've responded to that, with a background obviously of the increasing emergency housing challenges we have. So that's really that complexity of that operating environment. It certainly was the question too we presented to you, so what was our next steps in regard to engaging with accommodation providers. So that was seeking your support for the actions that we were intending to take. So when I presented this on the 31st of March, councillors, you'll recall at that meeting it was 2 years and 5 days since that first lockdown. And obviously now we're probably still within, if you look back at that time frame, we were probably still within that first lockdown 2 years ago. So that was the sort of the context and the starting point for us saying, so what has happened since then, and what has been some of the decisions that have been occurred. So if we just cast our minds back, a lot of the conditions that existed back 2 years are still the same things that we're dealing with now. So we've seen it through a lot of work that has been done either by Ministry of Housing and Urban Development on their place-based assessment, our own housing and business assessment, that there was a pre-existing lack of homes here in Rotorua. And probably also, and it's a discussion we've talked about previously, when you look at the national average of how many public housing units there are in our city compared with the national average, we've got less than half of the homes that are the national average for public or social housing. As a community, we've always had challenges around poverty and deprivation across our city and across our communities. And obviously you put on top of that in our community the impacts of COVID, which have been extremely hard hitting here in our community. So the removal of domestic tourism through various lockdowns at different stages, including more recently the Auckland ones, and the absence of international visitors because of the COVID pandemic. Obviously the huge impact there on the tourism sector, but also its spillover into other parts of our community and economy as well. And so the wider economic and therefore social impacts that have hit our community. That shortage of homes has also meant progressively over the last few years we've seen that increase in house prices, and more importantly for those who need homes, rental increases. So an increasing number of people displaced as rents increased. And if you still go back 2 years, some of the conversations we were having as a community was the concerns about people living in our parks, the homeless, and obviously a shelter that had opened at the time in the CBD, and the impacts of some of that disorder that occurred in our CBD. So that was kind of our environment back at the start of those first lockdowns, and of course few of those have changed as we've moved forward through COVID. So the government's responses, and really if we go back to something like the MSD emergency housing grants, you know, that was a framework that was set up in 2016. And so at the start, there wasn't that many people making use of the MSD emergency housing grants, but that rapidly ramped up to the numbers that we saw just before the COVID lockdowns, but more substantially through the last 2 years as those numbers continue to increase, as there is no place for them then to move on to in the way of social or public housing.
me to cut in, but you are addressing us, and several people are just writing. I feel that this is very important. I moved it into public. Oh, good. I'm not questioning what you're writing, but I do hope we're all focused on the presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you, JP.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Sorry, point of order, Madam Mayor. JP is just reiterating what we've already had presented. I didn't stop it at first because I understand it is such an important topic that the community wants to hear about, but it is very unusual and unprecedented that we not either rediscuss or relitigate any issues from minutes. That's usually been quite a staunch order when people have tried to ask questions about it. So I think that's probably just why some of us are a little bit surprised this is being repeated to us again.
I can assure all councillors there's no decision to be made. This is information that I feel is very important at this point in time to be out in the public domain. Do continue, Councillor.
Sorry, point of order.
Well, we're in the middle of a presentation.
Are you going to accept this point of order?
Yes.
You are, thank
Yes.
you. I think under standing orders you're obliged to accept standing orders. You're obliged to accept points of order.
Could you tell us what the point of order is?
I'll be pleased to. I habitually take notes in all meetings that I'm in, and I resent an implied piece of chastisement that I should stop taking notes on the pretext that I'm not paying attention.
It's not a point of order.
I am paying attention, so I'd ask you not to be so overbearing. Thank you.
Well, I hope we all find this update interesting because it's very important in relation to our community and where we as a council find ourselves at today, which is quite different to March. Carry on, JP.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I suppose just talking about, and it's probably the point I'm trying to make here, is that the system that MSD has operated to try and house those who do not have accommodation is seen as supporting someone to go as a guest and seek their own accommodation in a motel. So that's the government sort of framework. Obviously, that's become an opportunity then for accommodation providers who had lost significant amounts of international visitors and domestically as well, with various lockdowns as well, to pivot and take up some new opportunities. So a number of motels have been used actively, either partially or fully, for emergency housing, to the point, and we also seen them actually operating as a business model where they're actually advertising for additional clients to come and stay in their motels. So in effect, a new market has been developed through those accommodation providers. So apologies, my boxes have gone a bit wonky on the screen there, but just talking about, so the impact of this is as we moved into that lockdown phase, we saw the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development contract 3 motels for the homeless, so that addressed the homeless shelter and the COVID risk that has existed for them and for those people who were living in parks. And we saw the gradual and continued increase in the number of people making use of emergency housing through some of our accommodation providers. Now, obviously, that concentration is mainly in or around the CBD, Tuarira Road, and obviously Fenton Street. So that was where obviously most of our motel accommodations are. The consequences of that and the impacts of that is clearly there has been increases in crime concentrations by a small percentage of those people who needed emergency housing, and also some of the social implications and community impacts that we saw around those facilities. And then, of course, as we've continued to see the disruption of COVID lockdowns, job losses and business closures through that period as well, and continued increases in rents. So the pressure on families and individuals around their housing has led to further distress and further dependence on the emergency housing model. So the consequences of that, and obviously some of those communities were deeply affected, and we still saw complaints then and damage in the media about some of those disorder and impacts that were spilling out of motel accommodation used for emergency housing. As a council, we also expressed concerns to the government agencies about the unmanaged approach to that accommodation and the placement of families with singles and the sort of the guest-based approach to finding accommodation, which puts different cohorts of people together in what is and should be temporary accommodation. So again, just talking about, so what has the council done across those 2 years? Clearly Her Worship has repeatedly raised at every opportunity with the Prime Minister and the key ministers involved in the housing or social service provision through MSD, Minister Woods and Minister Sepuloni, our concerns about the appropriateness and safety of this accommodation and obviously also the long-term need for public homes or social housing so that people can actually come out of this temporary solution. So a really important set of issues to raise. As a council itself and within our normal operating framework, we've continued to focus on how do we encourage homes to be built and development to occur in our city. So we, as you're aware and everyone is aware of, things like the National Policy Statement, our district plan, intensification plan changes, but equally through this 2-year period, our applications for funding to put in place the infrastructure to support further housing development. So that was the Crown Infrastructure Partnership applications we did probably almost 2 years ago. And more recently, the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund application seeking support for stormwater so that we can ensure that we have the capacity in place to have homes built. So as an action following Her Worship's discussions with those ministers, there was an agreement by government late in 2020 to establish an emergency housing task force, which kicked off in April of last year in 2021. So there was an intense amount of work there for several months and a number of recommendations presented to ministers in late May of 2021. So that really focused on the need to protect families. So the view there that some exclusive use and managed facilities needed to be identified, and 13 motels were proposed to be contracted. And importantly, from a Rotorua Lakes Council perspective, also that the appropriate consents and Building Act compliance be achieved for those facilities. Some of the other recommendations that were put forward, which was to continue to focus on efforts around the unmanaged motels, were set aside until the hub was in place. So the hub providing that triage of management and support services for individuals, particularly those singles who continue to occupy unmanaged motels, was an important piece in that puzzle as well. However, that did not take away from the need for Rotorua Lakes Council to look towards its regulatory requirements as well. But it was important for us to see how the hub moved forward, but also the outcomes of the Emergency Housing Task Force. So since then, in late last year, Council started to talk directly to accommodation providers. We obviously sent out some information reminding people of the importance of Building Act safety, as there was a number of motel fires. Also reminding them of the need to continue to keep up with their building warrant of fitnesses. And equally, we identified 7 additional accommodation providers who we believed should be progressing towards a consenting approach. So we reached out to those. So we saw those as being a high priority, and I'll talk a bit more about those in the next couple of slides. So, councillors, we've continued to focus for us on the changed space now to say, look, our goal has always been to ensure that the accommodation is safe and appropriate. So from a Building Act, that focuses on the premise itself, and from an RMA, it focuses on the community and the wider impacts on the environment as well. So those communities where these accommodation providers are in place. So we need to keep that focus there. We talked to you about moving to a situation where we reach out to accommodation providers based on resourcing, not just of council, but out there in the community to support accommodation providers to seek the appropriate consents and also to ensure that there was time given for people to start moving through consenting and making changes to facilities where they're required. So what's important within that we considered there was sufficient supply of emergency housing, that we had already established a pathway and a consenting route for the 13 consented motels, or 13 motels to be consented, which are currently contracted for families, and also to give time for those operators to make sure that they could find appropriate tradespeople or consultants to assist them with those kind of changes, and certainly allow them to make a genuine choice about continuing to provide emergency housing accommodation or reverting to the tourism opportunities. So if I was to sort of summarise the last two years, councillors, it would be a case of saying, look, across those 2 years we've continued to see the expression of the housing crisis, which existed pre-COVID. We've seen the continued dire necessity for some form of emergency housing because we do not have sufficient public homes or public housing for people to move into. We've had to recognise the disruption and the impact of COVID and the pandemic lockdowns that have come and gone without any particular system, and also recognition that government had accepted that we needed to work with a task force to try and address some of those key issues. So that's been the sort of the context over the last 2 years. As far as us moving more into taking a regulatory approach and encouraging some of the accommodation providers to seek consents, there's been a number of factors which have led to that position. Probably the first is we've now moved into more of a stable COVID management approach environment. So the pandemic impacts have been set aside and the management approach is more clear. There is an acknowledgement from the Emergency Housing Task Force that having achieved a contracting 13 motels with support services and a consenting pathway, our next step was to look at the unmanaged additional motels and accommodation providers. The hub, as opening, provides a really important framework for local management of clients and the ability to help make sure that they have the appropriate services and they go into appropriate and safe facilities as a cohort. The return of international visitors later in the year or progressively also enables our accommodation providers who are businesses in their own right to make a choice about whether they continue to provide emergency housing, and as I say, with the right consenting and appropriate facilities, or whether they move back to providing accommodation for visitors. And clearly also the need to address some of the wider social and crime impacts around this concentration of emergency housing facilities. So that's really what's changed from the previous 2 years. So, councillors, the one slide I've added was just to set out where we're currently up to with the different motels we've reached out to date. So back in December, we sent an initial letter to 7 accommodation providers. So this is outside of the 13 that are already in a consenting route, inviting them to come and discuss consenting and Building Act requirements with us. So that was sent out to 7 accommodation providers in December. We had no responses from those, so they received a visit and a discussion with some of our staff in late January, early February, where they were reminded that a letter had been sent and inviting them to come and talk to council. A second letter was then sent confirming that visit and again repeating the request that they engage with council on both the RMA or district plan consenting pathway and also a discussion around the Building Act. Again, we received no response. So approximately 10 days ago, we issued a third letter, and that gave them 10 days to respond to us and to make contact with council to discuss consenting. That 10-day period is now up on Tuesday of next week. In addition to those 7 councillors, we added 2 more that we had fast-tracked through and we believed were of a reasonably high risk on the safety of their buildings and should be included. So 9 had received that 10-day response letter. That letter details to those 9 accommodation providers is that if they do not engage with council, that council will proceed to the Environment Court and seek an enforcement order on those 9 accommodation providers. What that enforcement order seeks is a determination by the Environment Court that they must obtain consents from us or cease operation as an emergency housing facility. So that's the 2 choices being put to those providers. In that determination, clearly also there needs to be a period in which they can comply. So in getting that sort of enforcement order saying they are required to get a consent, there is also a pragmatic view of how long a consent may be required. So it may be a period of 6 or 9 months for them to proceed into making the relevant applications for a consent or making the changes that are required to buildings. So that's the process we're now undertaking with the 9. So at this stage, we've had a number respond. So at this stage, I'm not able to tell you whether we will be proceeding to the Environment Court with some of the 9 or any of them. So that will be something we can update you on later. But at this stage, I don't have that answer until Tuesday of next week. What we are doing next week is to send to all providers who are providing emergency housing the first letter. So we're now starting to repeat the process on all remaining accommodation providers who have been providing emergency housing. So whilst we've got 13 in a consenting pathway, and we're now looking to add another 9. We'll then be sending a letter to all others to begin back at that first letter and asking them to engage with council. So, as I say, council, that was the 1 extra slide I added to the presentation I'd given you a month ago, and also just that update on the fact that those 9 letters had been sent, the deadline for that of next Tuesday, and the intention to send first letters to all other emergency housing providers next week.
Thank you, JP, and we will open for questions, and this is the reason why this item was brought into public, as it is such a high public interest. Questions? Councillor Rakawatate.
Yes, Madam Chair, I fully appreciate that this is of high interest to our public. And having listened to the presentation, and it was in our papers a month ago, I actually see no reason why it wasn't in public a month ago. I mean, we've sat through this again, and you know, that means, to me, that really does mean we should be looking more carefully at what we do put in to our public excluded section, because I hear nothing in this, apart from that last slide, but there's nothing here that to me would have sent signals a month ago we need to have this in public excluded. So that's just a comment that I want to make. There's nothing here that would cause commercial sensitivity.
Yep.
So, you know, I just think if it's that important that a month later we have to haul it into now into the public session, then why couldn't it have been in the could it have not been in the public session a month ago? I
understand your question, JP. Could you answer that about what has changed?
Through your worship, it's a very good question. But again, the paper focused last time on saying, hey, we've we've got a couple of options of our legal strategy, and that was the piece that we really wanted to take a steer from you on, those several options that we identified in that legal strategy, and also how we were managing the phasing of it. So it was more that legal strategy piece. I think your comment now is because those letters have been sent, and because more letters will be sent next week, the likelihood of it being discussed or openly discussed within the public has now reached that point. So you're right, that it is public with the fact that we have sent those letters. But as I say, that when we discussed this previously, or we were seeking some guidance on the legal strategy we were seeking to proceed with.
Feel, Madam Chair, that that is a decision actually for councillors to make around what goes into public excluded. No, I mean this is something, and you've said it, and you've said it. This is what the public want to know. And when we decide a month later, oh well, let's bring it into the public, when it could have been in the public right from the start. So I'm just saying, perhaps for future reference. That's all. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I think there has been a substantive change from March. Lead that we gave. It's an indication that letters have now been written, and it's for us all to know. Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you, Your Worship, through you. JP, just turning to the drop dead date and the requirement to lodge a consent or proceedings will commence. What are the penalties? Can the court start imposing penalties no consent is lodged, and is there like a daily rate for non-compliance?
Councillor, that's part of the reasoning behind the strategy we've taken. So we've been careful to make sure that the invitations have been there, several letters. So our intention is just to make sure that if we get to a point where we've sought an enforcement order and there is non-compliance around engaging with us around a consent or the Building Act, we are in the best possible position to move to either prosecutions and enforcement.
Councillor Yates.
Morena, and through you, Your Worship. JP, just a confirmation of the 7 that you've referred to, actually 9, sorry, we'll change that to 9. Are they fully tenanted currently with MSD clients, or are they the partially tenanted?
Our understanding and from the teams, the visits the team have made, they are fully operating as emergency housing.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 2 questions. JP, what are we doing in terms of a social media strategy or a media strategy full stop to say Rotorua is closed? We don't want any more people coming in here trying to buy a motel, trying to set up as an emergency housing operation. I know that there was some suggestion that the LIMs would be used and real estate agents would be notified. So what can we do about just making sure that people know we are closed, we don't want any more of these facilities?
Through you, Worship, I think what we need to communicate is the consenting requirements. So people will make business choices, but at the moment there is a view that you can purchase into a motel, and a number have sold on the basis that they have a new current existing use, which is unconsented. So we're trying to make sure that people are fully aware. So the letters that we will be sending out to all premises will be putting on property files so that they are accessible, and we'll also be communicating to make sure people are understanding there is a consenting pathway they need to go through. So if anyone's considering selling or purchasing within the city, they need to be aware of that. We were made aware of a recent sale, and the regulatory team under Anaru have actually contacted that new owner and advised them of those consenting requirements directly. So as I say, the letters out to all are really important for next week, but equally when we're made aware of a sale, we're directly reaching out to them and passing on that information. And your comment about reaching out to real estate agents, we'll be doing the same with them as well.
Okay, just one further question, Madam Chair. Just a question, because we're saying that we've sent a letter saying you now have to comply, you need to go to the Environment Court to get, or if you don't comply to get the right consent. But we don't want to have all of these motels suddenly applying for consent. So what is the mechanism that we can use to ensure that not all of the motels can turn into long-term emergency accommodation? Because effectively, if we're saying go down this pathway, they all now apply for the appropriate resource consents and they get them, we then have no option of closing down the problem that we have in Fenton Street.
I think the issue here is that businesses can apply for a consent and make a decision about what activity they choose to undertake. Now, the consenting procedure is one where an individual facility and the cumulative impacts can be assessed, but it has to be through a consenting process. So again, anyone can apply for a resource consent, but it's that consenting process and the hearing and the decisions of commissioners that will determine whether they are allowed to do that and whether there's any substantial or cumulative impacts outside of that. So it has to be the cumulative effect. We cannot dictate to someone how they seek to use their property, except through the rules we already have in our district plan.
Just a comment then, if it's taking the cumulative effect, then we really need to be targeting all of these motels all at the same time, because otherwise we can't determine what is the maximum number of motels that should be allowed to transition to long-term housing if we're taking this piecemeal approach. And that's why I think I had made a comment before that it would be good if we could have taken a wholesale approach to all of them without determining whether they were the problem ones or not. And I understand the comment that you made that we need to ensure that there is some housing available, but just don't want to see that we end up with some other unintended consequences down the line. Thank you.
Councillor, I think the key there is that that's the intention of the letter going out to all of them next week, is we need to raise the awareness with them about what business do they want to be in. But again, we cannot dictate to them singularly or cumulatively what that choice will need to be. We have a district plan and we have a consenting procedure for them to make their choices. So again, part of that will be then the cumulative question of the consenting discussion, but all we can do is make sure that they're all aware of the requirements from this council, and also what that then means for them to start engaging with a planning consultant to assist them, or certainly wait for us to encourage them into that pathway.
Thank you, Worship. Through your Worship, JP. Just got a couple of questions and comments, mainly particularly without trying to really educate what Sandra has covered very beautifully. As we close some accommodation sectors, mainly motels and stuff, through what our district plan should have done earlier, the situation was such. However, how are we going to navigate providing to be a tourist destination as we have Rotorua economic development solely and fully the heart of trying to bring Vista destination to our city? If we close accommodations for long-term stays, what is the strategy to provide? If we are going to close the doors on one business, how are we going to open it for the real tourism business? That remains contentious. It's never been answered. And the other thing is, has there been a well-being impact assessment done for the future of our community based on the fact that there are going to be so many kainga ora type of housing? This is not about race, religion, or the type of people that are coming in, but the fact that kainga ora, being one of the biggest landlords, bringing people, because for the last 2 years, we've just seen numbers spike up. And because the numbers pressure are, the only analogy I can use is seeing a bad American movie where the police are under pressure because there is a murder in town, there's 3 murders in town, let's find a killer. So to find a killer, to put the statistics numbers right, we are trying to now ad hoc go what our district plan should have done in the first place. So my question is there a cultural impact well-being impact assessment done for our community as to when we flood the market for the homeless?
There was a couple of questions in there, and I'll go back to tourism for the starting point. If you go back to pre-COVID, this district was part of a national campaign to seek investment in 4- and 5-star motels. Project Palace is what it was called. We failed to elicit any international interest in investment in 4- and 5-star hotels in our district. And the reasoning behind that was because we had too many beds and we had too low a rack rate. So we had an oversupply. Now, if you look at our destination, we have continued to lag behind some of our competitors across the country in the percentage of beds in the 4- and 5-star category. We have an oversupply in the 2 and 3, and I'd probably be so brave as to say 1. And that discourages investment in the better quality facilities. It also means, because of the lower rack rate, we've seen an underinvestment in our current stock. And I've sat here before, and so has Andrew Wilson, and talked about the quality of our accommodation and our need to lift the yield from the visitor industry going forward. So that was the pre-existing conditions we had in our city. If you now fast forward to now, and the slow return of internationals and the slow return and probably the different composition of international visitors who will be coming to our country and our need to re-establish ourselves domestically, I would again say we have an oversupply of poorer quality accommodation in the visitor sector. So I would have suggested, and I made a comment at our last meeting, for those who have remained exclusively in the domestic visitor market, we've actually seen an increase in their yields. So their rack rates have increased substantially on where they were pre-COVID. So again, that talks to me to the supply and demand question, and for those quality facilities that have remained in the market, they are now being sought out and are able to charge a higher value because that supply has been withdrawn. So I think in the medium to long term, I think our city would benefit to see an exiting of a proportion of our current visitor accommodation, or a substantial investment in it or in new ones to lift the star rating and the quality of our accommodation as we start looking to a better yield from either domestic or international visitors. So we had some fundamental problems in our accommodation sector pre-COVID. If anything, we've probably seen a problem with the profitability of our accommodation sector through COVID, and that will have consequences adversely for us going forward. So actually to see the removal of some accommodation to different uses or redevelopment would be of benefit to us as a destination. As far as your second point is concerned, and I made the point earlier on, whilst we have a large number of people in emergency housing, we have an allocation of public housing in our city. So if you just look across the country and said there's 4% of public housing in homes across New Zealand, so 4%, we have less than 2%. So when you start looking at what's normal or the impact is, we have a shortage of public or social housing or affordable rental accommodation in our city to start with, let alone to deal with the problems we currently have in an emergency housing space. So that is why we've talked a lot about our lobbying of government to significantly increase the build of public housing. Simply on that national statistic there or national figures, let alone the specific problem we currently have around emergency housing accommodation. So there hasn't been any other studies other than that, and so that's just for us the current numbers of public homes versus the national average.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thanks. That question was one of mine as well on how we can protect the Rotorua brand as a top tourism destination. But I also support Councillor Kai Fong in that the Council must send a strong message that Rotorua is putting a stop to the inappropriate use of our motels. You've talked in this presentation about the impact to our community. We need to stop the misery that emergency housing is causing our community. So my question is, what support are we giving to the residents that are being impacted? I'm talking about those that live in the same areas as emergency housing motels. And are we able to share directly with them what we're doing, and how can we give them confidence that when they share their concerns with us, we are actually listening?
I'm just looking across at the Chief Executive, because it might be one of my colleagues who might need to come forward and just answer some of those questions. But I think as far as making people aware that we're now seeking accommodation providers to start looking at the consenting pathways. Remember, RMA consenting pathways is to start looking at the effects more widely than just the premise. It's the Building Act that looks specifically at the facility itself. So the consenting procedure is where we should be starting to address those community concerns. And as far as local actions are concerned, I think I need to throw across to my colleague who may be able to look at some of the work that's been done on Fenton Street and in those local communities.
And to the concerns expressed, it's the balance, isn't it, now that we've come out of COVID, about the sustainability of emergency housing at the same time as trying to build. And the cumulative effects of the Resource Management Act and your regulatory tools need to be taken into effect now.
Just add one other thing too, and part of this is also the need for accommodation. Yeah. One of the concerns that clearly our government partners have expressed and legitimately is we do not want to go back to a situation where we were pre-COVID, where we had people living in our parks or in doorways or sleeping in our car parking building. You know, there's some really untenable outcomes in this as well. So there is no perfect solution here. There is just we've got to manage a whole bunch of risks and concerns and impacts on not only the communities, but actually those people who need that accommodation. So there's a fine balancing act here of managing those processes. And one of the challenges we've had over the last 2 years is that disruptive impact of COVID and the COVID strategies of lockdowns and what that creates for the ability to take a longer term planned approach to either building or certainly consenting of some of these premises for alternative uses.
Councillor Maxwell and then Councillor Yates.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. You're right, JP, it's a fine balancing act, all right. Can you help me just get my head around, we've sent out letters 1, 2 and 3 and also personal visits. The question I have is, why have not the responding of these people to us at all? We're in confidential. Why do you feel that they're not even responding?
We're not in confidential. We're not in confidential. I asked that this be brought forward because of the timing of the letters so that our community and our councillors all knew.
Your Worship, I suppose one of the challenges we have in the accommodation sector is sometimes that split between an owner and a lessee. So an owner in the background and someone who has obviously a long-term lease to operate an accommodation space. So some of the issues that we have is that we almost have to approach both and that's been one of the challenges, and it certainly will be one of the steps in the enforcement order process that we'll be seeking to name both an owner and a lessee to ensure we create that conversation that may not be occurring.
Councillor Yates and then Councillor Donaldson.
Through you, Your Worship, and I apologise for the supplementary, JP, but I really appreciate you raising the 4 5-star quality, which is what our aspiration should be set at, because obviously we've got 2 new motels being built along Ferry Springs Road, one of which has already become an emergency housing facility. My concerns are, and I know that our community's concerns are, about what is going to happen to those, because those are just in the pipeline, not yet completed. Any ideas on what those will be used for?
Can't mention specific.
Again, councillors, there's an individual business and an individual owner who needs to make some decisions about what path they should be progressing. I suppose what we're trying to now send very clearly to our community is, as our borders open up, as we've got a stable management of COVID moving forward, business owners need to make a choice of what business they're in. And if they're in the business of emergency housing, it's not recognised. It's not recognised within our district plan, and you'll have to seek a consent, or you'll have to continue on with the purpose you're permitted to do as a motel and serve our visitor and tourism sector.
Councillor McPherson, sorry I overlooked you and was reminded by the clerk. It's hard to keep your eyes everywhere. And then Councillor Donaldson.
No problem. Through you, Madam Chair, I'm intrigued with the question of coordination. You've got multiple factors and we don't have a clear view as councillors of the rate at which the changes are going to be occurring. And if I could just quickly enumerate them, you've got the rate of downscaling of emergency accommodation, which is dependent on the extent to which the enforcement is effective, and it may or may not, it'll be partially effective, no doubt. Alongside that, you've got an immigration of homeless managed by a different agency, MSD, and the extent to which they may be biddable is possibly an open question. Thirdly, we've got the rate of building of homes by Kāinga Ora. So you've got 3 largely independently operating factors. So we come back to the question of how are these 3 rates of change going to be coordinated? Because as I understand it, Council does not have an oversight, overview, control over these 3 disparate areas. How is that to be managed? Thank you. That's my first question, by the way.
And Councillor, you've touched on the key piece here is that our ability to actually act here is quite limited. We have our regulatory functions and the enforcement of our district plan, but we also need to look across to the needs of the government departments and the pace on which they can change and manage either house building or clients. So, as I say, there is a limited amount we can do other than ensure we continue to talk to them about what they're doing, where they're up to, and also encourage the pace of building where we can. So, as I say, the concern being expressed by government agencies is please take a managed approach to this. Again, part of that will be dependent on the responses of the motels and accommodation providers themselves, because they express a concern that if we see a number of facilities stepping out of providing emergency housing at this stage, there is genuine concerns we will see people displaced back into cars, parks, and unsuitable outcomes in that space. So there is a risk that they express across to us. They want to make sure people are housed, and so we must be conscious of that. But clearly we have a regulatory requirement to see safe and appropriate facilities in place. So there is that is all we can do is continue that communication. I don't know if the Chief Executive wants to add anything more to that.
Thanks for that. And through you, Your Worship. Look, and I just wanted to go back, I think, to an earlier question from Councillor Tapsell around how do we actually provide assurance to residents surrounding the areas that have been used for accommodation that we're doing everything we can and that they are safe. And look, it's a very easy question to ask, but a very difficult solution to provide, because there are multiple tensions here, as Councillor McPherson is correctly pointing out. The challenges, as I see it, is that this is a long-term rolling issue, and it started with the first challenge of being how, when the country needs to go into lockdown, do we ensure that Rotorua is able to go into lockdown when we have people living in cars, living in parks and reserves and so on? Because while people are living in reserves and in cars, Rotorua couldn't go into lockdown. So that was actually a paramount necessity to try and find a solution to. And I think, Councillor McPherson, you'd be quite right in saying, but we don't have any of the tools that are needed to do that. All we've got is the ability to influence others. The second set of challenges is that how, when we've got people needing emergency accommodation, and these are people that have been in our community displaced from rentals or alternatively living in unacceptable accommodation situations, that they elect to go to a government agency and say, we need emergency accommodation. Now, notwithstanding the comments that as to the percentage of those people which are from this community as opposed to other communities, what we do know is a large percentage of that cohort is actually people who have lived in Rotorua. And so the challenge for the council is, how do we ensure that in this situation that those placements are appropriate, that the people who are being moved into those places receive the appropriate supports, counselling and advice they needed to be able to live a successful, sustainable lifestyle? Because clearly this is a group who are some of our most vulnerable people. And so what role has council got in there? What can we influence? Well, the reality, how we influenced that was to bring together those agencies that did have responsibility for these various matters together with us in the Housing Task Force. And that resulted in a multiple group of agencies coming together to look at this problem and to try and come up with a solution which is a different solution for Rotorua, and that resulted in contracted facilities and the management of those facilities and provision of support services. At the same time, the Ministry of Social Development recognised that there needed to be a different front gateway into facilities, and so they've put in place the hub that is actually now in Fenton Street across from Council. All of this happened as a result of the Housing Task Force. The intent was, one, to actually ensure that support was available and emergency housing in Rotorua was available for people, but at the same time to have it available in a way that minimised the impact on the surrounding community. Going on from that at the same time, and obviously you know this because you directed us to look at the matter of public safety, and there is at the moment a piece of work that has been led by Anaru, which is actually standing up a safety in public spaces strategy, which will actually give a much more coherent answer to how do we deal with public safety more generally. But coming back to the issue of actually emergency accommodation and the use of motels in particular, there's recognition, and this is what JP has provided you with a briefing on, that there are ongoing situations which we have got no control on, that it seems like causing ongoing concern, and that is where we're using now our regulatory tools to start addressing these issues. The key challenge here is that this is well outside of the ability of council to directly control. We've only really got our ability to influence. And I think if you look in respect to how how successful have we been? I think if you look at the contracting of facilities, the provision of support services, the provision of a new housing, emergency housing pathway being stood up by government, all of this has actually happened as a result of influence. We've not been able to control any of this. So I think you can say that that's a success story, although it's an imperfect one, because clearly we wouldn't be moving through to looking at our regulatory tools if it had been completely successful, nor would we be necessarily looking at the ongoing need and questions around public safety. But those are things that we do see as being needed, and that you've certainly provided us direction to address.
Yes, my supplementary actually touches on what the Chief Executive, through you, Chair, touches on the points that he's made about the crucial role being played by the Housing Task Force. And I wondered if after all the time, and there has been, I wouldn't quite rate it as a success yet, so it might be a bit premature to judge what's happened as a success, because there's a great deal, as others have pointed out, a great deal of disquiet about some components. But I wondered to what extent there is going to be a method or process by which the service of this Housing Task Force can boost its effectiveness and efficiency, in particular the role of the hub, and how I would suggest its role is going to have to change over time. There is a small danger here that it could become a monopoly for MSD and get to the stage of managing the affairs of MSD locally. And I wondered to what extent that has been anticipated, the need for ongoing learning. Thank you.
Again, it'd be interesting to raise this with MSD, but MSD clearly has contracted a provider and would have a pretty clear set of deliverables and expectations from the provider who is supporting them through or delivering the services through the hub. And there is also a mix of other service providers that they contract around that. So my understanding of MSD is they will be carefully monitoring and managing and reviewing their own contracts. So probably the learnings will come clearly through their contracting and the way they manage their contracts moving forward. I suppose we continue to try and influence, as the Chief Executive said, with the local knowledge that we have as a community into the provision of services by MSD and by other government agencies here that reflect our local needs. And I think that's the influence and the information that we bring to those task force discussions, and the ability for us to provide some good insights for those departments when they look and review their contracts.
Supplementary was that given the structural anomalies, a more accurate description of what's going on is that the agencies are all sort of muddling through. There's no systematic overarching coordination involved.
Point of order, just...
That therefore suggests, does it not, the need
my
for
point of order
legislative
is
change?
you've got that as an assumption.
No, no, it wasn't quite. My question was at a different order. That is that structurally, organisationally, we've got a series of well-intentioned agencies all doing their best, but they do have to varying degrees, different objectives. They have different purposes. And coordinating that lot means, therefore, that these groups, including our council, has to muddle through and do the best that it can, given these anomalies, structural anomalies.
Take a point of order there too. I think we're dealing with perception here about government agencies, but I do agree that we can call an agency here to hold them to account and ask, where is it going? You want to answer that?
Councillor, and maybe this is just a reflection on the Emergency Housing Task Force itself. As I said, Her Worship, in prompting ministers to consider participating in a task force. So we had two different agencies and ministers there, Minister Cepoloni and Minister Woods, directed quite senior officials within their departments to engage with us. And Rosemary and I have been here previously to say it was incredibly valuable to have them send those officials here and work collaboratively in the same space with us and with local iwi and service providers. So the level of understanding of the complexity and the cross-agency impacts was very much in the front of their minds during that task force process. And as the Chief Executive said, that really resulted in the bespoke solutions that we have achieved here as a community. So the ministers have both commented on the contracting of the motels as something that's only been done here. The provision of wraparound services into those motels put aside for families is only a solution being provided here. The development and the contracting of service providers for the hub is a solution that's only been provided here. And that's reflective of that cross-agency working, recognising different pieces of legislation, but I think what we had there was senior enough officials at the table who could navigate through to solutions and obviously also to identify funding pathways. The reflections of how successful it will be is something that is ongoing, but as I say, I think that cross-departmental working and cross-legislative working has been facilitated by extremely senior sponsorship by government into that task force.
I'm going to move to the next two questioners. That was slightly outside of the scope of what we're listening to in terms of the timing and the letters, but it is all very important for the community to know. Councillor Donaldson and then Councillor Rotorua-Tate.
Thank you, Worship. Through you, and mine's probably a little bit off-piste as well, but along the lines of what Councillor McPherson raised, it is, JP, as you've highlighted, where we've got half the national average for public housing stock, and like Councillor Kaifong, we'd all like to see a sinking lid on these contracted motels. But if we see, as has been stated, the public housing that's being built allocated on a national waiting list basis, then we're just going to be filling a hole, because we're not the only city with this problem with a whole lot of transitional housing. So is there a non-siloed approach, I think is my question, within the task force to address our problems here in Rotorua with the building of public housing, which I've already heard resistance to from a number of quarters, and I think we have to support that.
Worship, and I'll try and keep this one short. Yes, and I think that is the value of the ongoing operational space we now are in with that task force. Those recommendations were put forward, the new services put in place, but there is a continued discussion and dialogue across agencies about the sensitivities and the issues that are created. So the issue of the points that people have on the National Housing Register and the risk that that creates of someone from out of town being allocated a home that is built here has been raised with all of those agencies. And just like they have operated in the task force previously, they are looking at, okay, so what options are there to mitigate that risk or that challenge locally?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Look, this is obviously, as you said, bringing it into the public forum and public part. It's a big issue for the community, but I really do think that it isn't just a housing issue. But what I do think is that we're trying to address a housing issue, but we're also setting up some significant health issues for those families who are long-term in motel accommodation, and that's the individual and also the families. And so we need to be aware of that. And I know what emergency accommodation is, believe me. And I would say that half of the people in the so-called emergency accommodation are not the usual recipients of emergency accommodation. And I also don't believe that the support services that they require is anywhere near getting to them in a timely fashion. So we're not doing the monitoring of these things as we should do. But I'm really concerned because I think it's injurious to the health of those individuals and families, and particularly children, because we keep talking about how can we make the motels more compliant so that we can house families there. But long term, that should not be the solution. So, and you know, I know that when we went into lockdown, we tried to get the people, the families and the individuals out of their cars, but we've got way more than those numbers in our motels now. So I'm just signalling that, and it comes back to what Councillor Kumar said, there is a need to do some impact assessment on, well, particularly those in the motels, because you can already see what that is. And I want to say that I live in Rotorua Road, and I can tell you, I see the behaviours, I see the police cars. And recently I thought, if I hadn't thought that this too would pass, I'd be looking to move from my street. I'm 3 minutes in the car to here, so why should I move? I love my home. But that is what so many people in various communities around our city are now thinking. So it's just that we need to think of it not just as a housing issue. And when we're talking to MSD, they need to know that long term, this is going to come back to bite the taxpayer in the bum because of the health issues that are going to arise. And so this is, I'm just saying that while we're looking at it strictly as a housing, it's not only a housing issue. We're creating significant health issues, I believe, long term for the people who currently live and may go into that accommodation.
Consistent that emergency accommodation in motels is not a long-term option. Absolutely consistent. So this is a regulatory tool. I think we've all had a good crack at that. It was important that this was advised today in public. So my apologies, thank you JP, my apologies for confusing the agenda, Councillor Wang, and we'll return now to recommendation 1. So we've accepted the motion for the Strategy, Policy and Finance Committee meeting be adopted, and we move now. I need a mover and a seconder for recommendation 1, the waste minimisation management, the waste management and minimisation plan. We've got a mover and a seconder. Are there any discussion? And JP is here. Stavros, is here if there's any discussion around the waste management and minimisation plan, which we covered well. There appears to be none. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary? Carried. Move now to recommendation 2, the organic waste collection, commence consultation. Are there any questions or points of clarification of Stavros? There appear to be none. I need a mover and a seconder for the motion that Council commence public consultation on the introduction of an organic waste collection service. Moved Councillor Wang, seconded Councillor McPherson. Is there any discussion that councillors wish to have? Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Your Worship. Your Worship, I believe there would have been, before we go out for public consultation, there would have been quite a few public submissions on this. Is that going to be part of the process for how we look at it, or is the submissions going to be heard separately?
Well, we're commencing consultation, so that is asking for input from the public. Does an officer wish to answer that? Stavros, do you want to say what it'll look like?
Thank you, Your Worship. No, as you said, the intent of consultation is to put proposals forward to the public. Public will have views, will receive the views, we will address them, and obviously if individual members of the public want to have a hearing process, we will do so before you decide the next step.
Any other questions for clarification or discussion? Right, I ask for a mover that Council commence public consultation on the introduction of an organic waste collection. We've done that. Seconded. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary? Carried. Resolution to go into public excluded. I advise there are 2 items for consideration. The confidential minutes from the meeting on the 31st of March 2022 and recommendations from other committees that are confidential items to enable commercial activities and to prevent the use of information for improper gain or advantage. Do I have a mover and a seconder? Moved Councillor Rotorua, seconded Councillor Donaldson. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary? Carried. We will ensure that the live streaming is turned off, and then we'll go into the minutes, and remembering one item has been